her up.
So this project begins over at my table saw and shop saw, where I'll cut to final length all the pieces of this project. A full cut list can be found at my website, diybuilds.ca, for absolutely free, along with all my other projects. To entirely build this project, it takes one sheet of 4x8 by 3/4 inch thick plywood and one small piece of 1/4 inch plywood. Now with all the rectangular shapes cut to final size, I can begin working on the leg structure. This begins by taking the corner off both sets of legs at the same time, and then over at my assembly table, marking out the exact structure of the legs and where I need to cut. This will help me get an exact placement of where I need to line up the chop saw using the laser on the chop saw itself. I'm using the chop saw to make about 90% of this cut, as I can't do the entire cut with the chop saw. It'll have to be finished up with the jigsaw. I'm trying to avoid as much jigsaw work as possible, as it leaves a much rougher edge, and it's pretty much ready for edge banding right off the circular saw or chop saw. Now with the jigsaw I can flush up all the corners, being sure to score the top side with a knife beforehand to reduce tear out. As you can see, my supervisor is making sure I'm doing a damn fine job. So over at the 1-inch belt sander, I can smooth out those jigsaw cuts with the help of my boss in the background. I can then hold the legs in place with my triple screw gear vise, and then my helper here is going to help me do some edge banding, which just simply gets ironed on and then pressed flat with a push block. Once the edge banding is fully cured, I can cut off the edges with an X-Acto knife, and then over at my homemade pocket hole machine, I can drill pocket holes all along the top of this for mounting to the top of the table later, as well as the cross braces that go between the two sets of legs. Next up is edge banding all the individual pieces that need it for this project. I just made a video going over my step-by-step instructions on how to do edge banding, and in this video you'll notice that I use a chisel to scrape off the extra, whereas in that video I recommended using a flush trim bit in the router table. One disadvantage of using the chisel or a knife or something like that is that there is a lot more skill involved in using it, and you can easily gouge the wood, whereas I find the router table and the flush trim bit is basically bulletproof, although the bit does get gummed up pretty easily. Next, I can have both of my helpers lay out the lines for cutting out the handle on both sides of the drawers, which will be identical, as this drawer will be able to pull out from the front and back and have no actual slides. You could absolutely do this with a jigsaw, being sure to mark the top side with a knife to create a knife wall as to avoid chip out, but the bandsaw makes quick work of this, so that's what I used. After both drawer handles are cut out, it's back to the 1-inch belt sander to flush up everything and get rid of those nasty bandsaw marks. This actually left a really nice edge, which is required for edge banding. You don't want this to be in any way rough. Now I did go over in my mind how I was going to do this, should I break it up into pieces or whatever, but I found that basically heating up and gluing on one section at a time and kind of using the iron to create creases and exterior radius bends, it worked great. The wood didn't chip or crack. It must be the hot glue that's on the back that basically allowed it to keep its form and not crack like that, but this worked amazingly, and I would do it again in a heartbeat having known this technique now. So after all the edge banding's applied to the top, I take the knife and trim off the extra on both ends, then lay it on its face, and using the chisel again, knock off all the high edges on that extra bit of edge banding. At this point, all the cutouts and edge banding for the drawer are complete, so it's back over to the pocket hole machine to quickly knock out some holes in the side of the drawer, which is how I'm going to attach the front and back of the drawers together to create the box. Now, as you can see during assembly with pocket holes, it's very important to use as many clamps as possible to make sure that this does not move, as that 15-degree angle of the pocket hole really wants to pull it in towards itself. So you have to make sure this thing is totally square and totally locked down before you start driving screws in. After verifying the drawer is completely square, I flip it over and give it a light sanding with a random orbit sander at 220 grit, flip it back over and do the top side where I can, then some light hand sanding to get where I couldn't with the random orbit sander, and to knock off all the sharp edges on all the corners. Next, over at the router table, I have my 3/8 inch rabbiting bit installed, and I create a rabbet on the inside of the drawer to recess the 1/4 inch panel that's going to act as the drawer bottom and give the entire drawer rigidity. With that done, I can use it to mark out the length and width I need to cut onto this 1/4 inch piece of plywood, and this cut kind of sketches me out because of a previous video that happened. As you can see, this doesn't fit in the rounded corners, so I need to bring it over to my 1-inch strip sander and knock those corners down. One thing to note is to make sure that you sand the bottom panel before you install it, as it will be insanely hard to sand after the fact. Now, to install the base of this, I simply flip the drawer upside down, put a bunch of glue on the rabbet joint, and then weigh everything down with a bunch of random crap around the shop. Now that the drawer construction is complete, I can focus on completing the top and middle of the table. This needs to be edge banded on all 4 sides and flushed up and sanded. After that, it's back over to the pocket hole machine to drill out a bunch of pocket holes only in one side of the 3 vertical dividers that go between the top and middle of the table. Then with my random orbit sander, I can knock off all the fuzzy parts and sand every single piece down to 240 grit. As mentioned previously, it is extremely important when installing these pocket screws to clamp everything down in place to make sure nothing moves. I even move the clamps as I go and attach the screws down the line, making sure those edges are completely flush. As there's no glue and no other fasteners in these joints besides the pocket screws, it will have a tendency to pull itself towards that 15-degree slope. To install the center divider, I use a scrap piece of 1/8 inch hardboard as a spacer to make sure there's a little bit of wiggle room for the drawer to move in and out. Using clamps here is very important to clamp down tight and make sure the walls are parallel with the drawer. And then I can flip the table around and begin fastening the 3rd and final divider. I can then fasten the bottom of the table with a whole bunch of brad nails, making sure that everything stays aligned, and then come back and drive in a whole whack of 2-inch screws to keep everything in place permanently. These holes all needed to be drilled and then countersunk to try to avoid splitting the plywood as much as possible. With the main structure of the table complete, it's now time to lay out the legs and begin fastening them to each other and then down to the table. Again, clamps are very important when using pocket holes here. With the leg assembly complete, I flip it over and use my tape measure to find exact center of where it needs to be located on the bottom of the table. This is then screwed down with a whole whack of pocket screws, and the table is complete and ready for finish. The finish I chose to put on this was a semi-gloss water-based polyurethane by Minwax, and I sprayed on 3 coats, lightly sanding with 240 between coats. Then I used some paste wax where the drawer is going to slide in and out, and this made a night and day's difference to the operation of the drawer. And with that wax buffed off minutes later, the project is complete.
Score 1 for the big guy.